Okay, welcome to this GCSE RS revision video. This is video 5 of 5 videos looking at the component 1 topic, themes topic, good and evil. And in this video, we're going to look at the idea of God, free will, the origin and existence of evil, and focusing on the theodicies. We've mentioned the Augustinian soul-deciding theodicy. We're going to focus in this video a little bit more at the soul-making theodicy of John Hick and Irenaeus, and as an explanation for evil and the existence of evil in the world. So what are Christian attitudes to evil? Well, they are quite diverse. The general Christian belief is that God created people with free will, and that because we are not robots, we choose good or evil. And choosing evil causes suffering in the world. Now, this phrase robots and the way this is phrased is well known, but it's not well known that this is the idea of John Hick. This goes back to this philosopher in a book, God and Evil, back in the 1960s. Some believe that evil exists because it is necessary for people to develop, complete their moral souls. So this would be John Hick developing the Irenaean theory. And so this has been labelled a soul-making theory to differentiate it from Augustine's soul-deciding theory. We need to learn about morality and develop the proper virtues, which cannot be done without the existence of suffering and evil, and maybe much suffering and evil. Now, the origin of this idea is not with Hick, but with a 2nd century Christian father called Saint Irenaeus. Irenaeus believed that humans were not created perfect, which is what Augustine would later teach. But they were created in the image of God, not in his likeness, but in his image. And they need to grow, and they require growth to become spiritually perfect and moral, to become like God. In the same way, a child is like their parents, but they're not morally like their parents. They have to grow into that. So God allows evil to exist to enable spiritual growth. Irenaeus believed that God did not intervene in human affairs to prevent evil, because this would mean interfering with free will. Hick in the 20th century developed Irenaeus' ideas. He says if evil did not exist, murder and cancer, he gives as examples, then we would not be able to develop ourselves spiritually. Hick argued that since we cannot rationalize the suffering of the world, we must be able to understand God's plan or reasoning. What he called the counterfactual hypothesis, that we don't know all of the possible choices that God could make. We don't know that he's making, as another philosopher said, the best of all possible worlds, Leibniz. So Hick believed that humans were born at a great distance from God, a distance of knowledge that is called the epistemic distance. Therefore, there is a process of soul-making involved. God leaves us. He stands at a distance so that we can have genuine freedom to do good or to do evil. And this soul-making involves a struggle to find religious faith and a moral life. Roman Catholics are interested in this theodicy as much as Augustine's theodicy. The doctrine of original sin is the cause of sin. And it is linked with the story of Adam and Eve's disobedience. And this is important to Irenaeus as well. That God caused evil, disobedience to God is what caused evil to enter the world. Since then, people have been born with the ability to commit evil acts. And every baby is born with original evil. Now, this is a little bit more Augustinian. Irenaeus doesn't emphasize just as much the disobedience side of the original sin, but the ignorance side. And it's more of a mistake that we just lack knowledge, and therefore we make mistakes. We need to be educated and develop the virtues and become better. Now, one very early, even earlier than Irenaeus, theodicy is the story that's found in the book of Job. Job says many things. It tells Christians that we should not, in a way, question why we suffer. As Hick will point out in the counterfactual hypothesis. There are God works in kind of mysterious ways, meaning that we would not, even if God told us, be able to understand maybe his choices. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are higher than our ways. How could we know how choices that we make now would affect others in 10 years' time, or 100 or 1,000 years' time? And God calculates all of these things. He has his reasons for letting. So why Job says we need to trust that God has morally permissible reasons for letting the evil that does happen in our world, the suffering happen as it is. Humans will never be able to understand the mind of God because it's just so complex. He knows all of the possible events and the actual events that he brings about his purposes. And maybe his purposes aren't about developing a world of mere pleasure. Maybe it's about purpose. His purposes are about bringing about a world that more people choose to love and choose relationship with him, perhaps. So God chooses the suffering for us. He has a greater purpose at work, and he has reasons for permitting suffering in our life. Christians are reassured with the knowledge that God is compassionate and understanding. He will never give us more suffering than we're truly able to cope with. So this is a matter of some discussion and debate. Some Christians would say, I think suffering helps us to understand Jesus, who endured pain and suffering to bring an end to death forever, with the promise of everlasting life. Suffering is a way to bring me closer to Jesus and can bring about a greater good. And C.S. Lewis said, God just cannot be understandable. The problem of pain cannot be understandable unless God himself suffers. Some Christians say, I think evil is the absence of good. This is what Augustine argued, like St. Augustine. Some friends of mine think evil exists because of Satan. Think the book of Job, who creates evil in the form of temptation. Think Genesis, pain and suffering. Also, I think the world is not perfect. Think Irenaeus. Evil just happens sometimes, like cancer. So suffering exists in the world. Christians all acknowledge this. The news and media show us this daily. The causes of suffering, are diverse. Disease, war, greed, ambition, inequality, poverty, terrorism, natural disasters. What do Christians say about these things? Well, Christians view suffering in a number of ways. Suffering can be seen as a test. It can be seen as a punishment for sin. That God does seem to allow the consequences, at least in this life of sin, to happen to us. Is that a punishment of the wrath of God? Is that God just letting us face the consequences of our actions? Maybe both. Roman Catholics believe that the origin of suffering is original sin. Job tells us that suffering is part of God's plan. He knows what he needs to permit in the world, and he has reasons to permit it. He doesn't necessarily want us to suffer, and the suffering fulfills his purposes. We might not understand it, but we know that God will never allow us to suffer beyond our ability to cope with it. Suffering enables Christians to appreciate what is good in the world and allows them to grow close to Jesus, who himself suffered and died on the cross for the sins of humanity. The stories from the Bible, like Job, teach Christians that anyone can suffer, even good people. Bad things can happen to good people. It's just as much as good things can happen to bad people. It's not as simple as saying God blesses those that are rich and healthy are being blessed by God, and those who are being suffering are being punished by God. So this teaches Christians that anyone can suffer, and persevering with suffering can strengthen your faith. Humanists and atheists say suffering is a result of human choices have over their lives. Humans must take responsibility in how their lives work out. Some evils, like war and famine and poverty, are caused or made worse by human greed and foolishness. Some evils, earthquakes and floods, may have natural causes that happen by chance just because of the way the world is. Often those who suffer most are those not to blame. Humanists see the idea of original sin as unjust and cruel. They reject it. How can a newborn baby be sinful? Not all humans are innately flawed or sinful. It's up for humans to fight evil and suffering in the world. And there is terrible suffering in the world. Here are the words above Auschwitz. A terrible place, freedom through work. Well, there's really death through work. The Holocaust is often referred to as Jews as Shoah, meaning the catastrophe. Hitler's final solution put the Jews in death camps, resulting in deaths of over 10 million people in total. For some religious leaders, this is a dilemma as to how a just and loving and righteous God could have allowed the amount of suffering to happen. This is a different kind of question. The sheer quantity of suffering. Evil causes human suffering. Yes, God can relieve human suffering. All people believe that it's important to try and help those who are suffering. The ways to alleviate suffering include medical care, training, education, prayer, fundraising, counselling, rehabilitation programs, disaster relief, and building works. And Christians have been at the forefront of doing these things, starting hospitals, building schools, running charities, and so on. They believe in alleviating suffering as well as answering the philosophical problem of suffering. Humanists, too, are interested in charity. The British Humanist Association says we place human welfare and happiness at the centre of ethical decision making. Lastly, the problems of it, the presence of evil and suffering in the world has created a number of problems. The logical problem of evil in particular. God is who's believed to be all loving, all benevolent, all powerful, omnipotent, and omniscient. But because of this, evil should not really exist, but it does. This is therefore to suggest a number of possibilities that Epicurus suggests. Either he's not all powerful, he can't stop suffering, or he doesn't know what's happening, or he doesn't love us enough to want it to happen. But none of these are very satisfactory conclusions. Christians have their own solutions to the problem of evil and suffering. So as we've seen, free will is a common feature of these solutions, whether it's Augustine's or Irenaeus's. God has given us free will, and some humans choose good and some choose evil. Following Augustine, in particular, the Roman Catholic Church teaches the doctrine of original sin. Humans find it easier to do wrong, but with the help of God, they can choose to do right. Those who sin can atone and gain forgiveness for their sin through prayer, for the Roman Catholics, confession, and penance. A very Iranian approach as well. Some Christian denominations believe in predestination, either that God's already chosen those who reach salvation. Again, this is linked to this problem of free will. Predestination here is subtly different to fate. It's particularly focused on the idea of salvation after life on earth, not on the decision we've made during our earthly lives. So, we do have free will even though we're predestined, some Christians say. And we are fated, but we might be predestined. So, this is the last in the 5 videos on the revision topic, good. I go and do some practice questions, read some model essay answers, do the Quizlets, and have a go at the topic test.